Good morning, everybody. You are all welcome back to our Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity Loss. Thank you, everyone, for foregoing your sleep in of a Sunday morning, if that's something that you usually enjoy. And I hope you enjoyed yesterday. I certainly did, and I think from the conversations that we had yesterday evening, it seemed like a very fruitful day. So we're opening today with our plenary session, which is questions from the Assembly based on items that were discussed yesterday but that we didn't get to address. So I have a full spreadsheet that I've colour-coded in a way that only I can understand now. And I'm happy to go through some of those, but I also, I'm happy to throw it to the floor. So maybe we'll try a mismatch of the two. But I think, first of all, there's a couple of questions based on, what can the impact of this Assembly be? And I wanted to just kind of go through that maybe just for a moment to say that we might be very familiar with the referendum on marriage equality that came out of that Citizens' Assembly, the referendum on the 8th Amendment that came out from that Citizens' Assembly. When there isn't a referendum, it's kind of hard to know what happens from a Citizens' Assembly. So with the climate action one, the recommendations that they sent to government were brought to a specific Oireachtas committee that was set up. So there was a climate Oireachtas committee, which is joint party. And part of that was to strengthen the powers of the Climate Council. So that was one of the things that they did. And then out of the Oireachtas committee, looking at the recommendations from that Citizens' Assembly, that came to be the Climate Action Plan. And that came to be the Act, the Climate Act that was passed by government last year. So it takes a little bit of time. That was a few years, but that's where it came to. So that was tangible results from the Climate Citizens' Assembly. Last year, there was a Citizens' Assembly on gender equality. And their recommendations were brought to government. And again, they were brought to a specially set up Oireachtas Committee on Gender Equality, which was chaired by Ivana Bacik. They took all of the recommendations brought to them by that Citizens' Assembly and responded to them in a report that was only released in July. And as part of that, there will likely be a referendum next year on the constitution of the woman in the home. So that's the type of impact this Citizens' Assembly can have. The report that we make and create based on the recommendations that you will come up with, that report will be brought to government, and they have promised that they will respond to that. Now, you might like as an Assembly to say, well, we think there should be a special Oireachtas committee set up, and you might want to put that in as part of the recommendations. So this is all kind of up for grabs, but that's to tell you this is generally what has happened with the recent Citizens' Assemblies. So I certainly hope that it won't get ignored, but the government have promised to respond to it, and they would probably respond to it in the way that the gender one most recently was. There would be a report, and then it keeps going through the processes, and we would hope that there might be legislation, there may even be a referendum. So there is potential for this to have great impact. So I hope that assuages some of those queries and fears, because nobody wants to give up all this time if it's not actually going to mean something. So that's kind of one question that I wanted to address. And there's a second question that I actually just wanted to bring to Art, and I bring it to Art because Art is a Secretary General who has knowledge of how government works. And that question was, would it be better if there was just a biodiversity department set up with a minister in charge for it? That's two separate questions that I saw on the spreadsheet from yesterday. So Art, can I throw that one to you, please?
Thank you. Early in the morning, hospital pass, Yes, indeed. So the politics of this is, on the face of it, very simple, but technically it's quite difficult. The Constitution says that there can only be 15 ministers in the government. So there's a cap on the number of ministers that we can have. So if this group decides that there should be a minister with specific responsibility for biodiversity, then we're going to have to take away a minister for something else. So maybe we don't need a minister for health, or there has to be a minister for finance. That's it. But these are decisions that are made. Currently, responsibility for biodiversity rests with a Minister of State in the Department of Housing. It's Malcolm Noonan, and he's also responsible for electoral reform and a couple of other things as well. So I think we will have the opportunity to discuss it at some point over the next couple of months about where responsibility within government should lie for biodiversity. But you should be aware that the creation of a single department with a single minister with no responsibility for anything else is going to be quite difficult.
Thank you, Art. Now, I don't want to be guiding the whole thing or leading the whole thing, but I'm going to maybe prompt the first question because it was one of the ones that came from the very first session yesterday. And if Chris is on table 10, and if he remembers Chris, you had something about, is there a possibility that despite biodiversity loss and climate change, the Earth might actually adapt? Is that how you had it phrased? Can we get a microphone to table 10, please? And our EAG can warm up with how to answer that one.
Hi there. It's early morning. I'm just trying to think about yesterday. Sorry. My name is Chris, and okay, the question: is there a chance that, despite biodiversity loss and climate change, that the Earth will adapt? You know what I mean? That, you know, we were talking about, you know, the ice age, and it's kind of the Healy Ray theory on it, you know what I mean? That, you know, if we do nothing, will we still survive? You know what I mean? That idea.
Thanks, Chris. I just think it's an important one to start the day off with, because there's no point in us considering all of this if the Earth will actually be fine. So I'd like to throw that to our experts, please. Jenny?
Yeah, thank you for the excellent question, Chris. So one way of answering that would be to look back in the past. And in the deep geological past, we have events called mass extinctions. And we know that when the Earth undergoes, you know, really profound change, like we are undergoing now with climate change and pollution and, you know, all the events you've heard about yesterday, that a number of species go extinct, but some survive. So some species like these extreme conditions, like humans, for example. But what we can learn is that the pace of environmental change in the past was much slower, and species can adapt. The Earth can adapt if given enough time. But the problem today is that the pace of environmental change is really, it doesn't have any parallel with the past. So some species will survive, but it's going to put others under extreme pressure. So this is why we can't be complacent. We can't rely on that idea that everything will be okay. Everything will be okay in 1 million years, but, you know, how many species do we want to wipe out in the interim?
Thanks, Jenny. A nice sobering thought for the morning. Now, I think it's best to throw this to the floor, and I'll try and keep a track on the spreadsheet of things. Oh, sorry.
I'm just going to add to that as well. I think the big question on this one is will humans survive? And I think that's the question that we have to answer here. And under the potential events that have happened in the past that Jenny has referred to in terms of catastrophic events and the big extinction events, you know, it's been the main dominant species on the planet that have not survived, like the dinosaurs, for example. And in the past, it's been natural events or external events not caused by the species themselves, so they've had no control over it. The big difference in this situation is that this event is being caused by a species who's the dominant force and species on Earth at the moment, and supposedly an intelligent species. And it'd be absolutely insane of a species if they caused their own extinction, which is essentially the path we're on at the moment.
James, thank you.
No, but I think it's very important that we set that at the very start. You know, this is what we're dealing with here. You know, and when we hear people saying, "Oh, the Earth has always evolved," you know, of course it has, and it will always evolve. So that's 100% right. So it is. But I think the question for us as a species is, will we survive that? Yeah.
Now, Isn't that lovely? So I think now we'll throw it to the floor. If there are burning questions that I feel we're leaving out, I'll jump in. But otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to the tables. So if you want to start questions to the EAG, if you'd like to just put up your hand, I'll keep a note of the tables again, or Art will. So we've Anne on table 13, who were so quiet yesterday, so I'm going to get them in early now.
Thank you. I want to ask the panel about soil and the environmental assessment of soil, especially related to biodiversity of soil microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, and whatever. Will this aspect be discussed and investigated at the Assembly?
Thank you, Anne. James?
Yeah, I think this is key to our food production systems in general, so I hope that maybe will come up within our agriculture section in some form. Essentially, the soil is the medium or the foundation of our whole plant terrestrial systems, and a lot of the key species within that soil ecosystem are the unseen microbes. Instead of us standing on the shoulders of giants, essentially we're standing on the shoulders of microorganisms, and all the energy that's captured from the sun by photosynthesis goes through and is transformed into organic matter in the various bodies of plants and animals, of microbes. But all of that is eventually cycled through in the terrestrial ecosystems through the soil, and it's mainly the fungi, the microorganisms that cycle all that organic matter and convert it into usable forms for plants to grow again. So without the microbes, without functioning soil, without quality soil, the system essentially collapses. And I think because it is unseen, we've only been looking at this since basically the invention of microscopes by physicists over the last 200 years. We haven't seen that, it's been unseen. So in terms of a science, it's in terms of ecology, it's something that we don't know an awful lot about. There needs to be a real step up in our understanding of soils and how they function. But we do know enough to say that the microbes, the fungi, the soil is the foundations on which we all exist as a species.
Michal, would you like to come in as Soils Director?
It's a very important question, and from a European perspective, soil is certainly on the agenda. There have been attempts by the European Commission to actually have a directive that would actually require greater care for soils, because there's different elements to that debate. There's contaminated soils, but there's obviously the soils that we actually have as basically the underpinning for agriculture. So I would expect, in the context of the new Green Deal, that agenda, that there will be a lot more focus on issues such as the quality, the health of soils. There are a number of initiatives out of that European Green Deal to reduce the use of pesticides, for example, to reduce the use of fertilizers, because you have to understand what are the critical pressures in relation to the health of soils. So certainly I think it would be worth your while to have that perspective as well, and to be aware that there are debates taking place at the broader European level where soil is increasingly recognised as an area, policy area, that needs more attention.
Thank you, Michal, and thank you for that question, Anne, and it will certainly be part of the next weekend's discussion where we will be focusing on agriculture. So you can ask the more difficult questions then when we have more people to speak about it. So we had David from table 6 next. If we can get the microphone to David.
Thanks very much. My question is really about the value of behavioural change to people, because you're asking people to change behaviour. So my question is really about the power play between corporations and the environmental lobby. So corporations invest a lot of time and money in working out our consumer behaviour and controlling the way we live. And this seems to be, there's lots of potential here for changing people's behaviour. Now, the environmentalists don't seem to be particularly empowered in many, many ways. And this looks to me like a golden opportunity for corporations to strong-arm the environmentalists into behavioural change which restrict our rights and freedoms and may not end up in much environmental benefit. It may just end up looking like lockdown planet with carbon tax. You know, so how do we, what mechanisms are in place to defend the citizen against, or just estimate the value of the population behaviour that's being required against the benefit to the actual environment. And it seems to me that the environmentalists are in a very weak position here. So the kind of thing I'd love to see is fast-track constitutional challenges with actual judges who know what they're talking about and know what they're empowered to deal with things. So my question is, how do we value the actual environmental benefit as opposed to the restrictions and the changed behaviours of the ordinary people? You've seen it with farmers in the past, you know. So that's really where I'm coming from.
Thank you, David. I think that's $1 million question. I think if we can solve that one, we'll have aced it. I'll throw to Mary and Micheál.
Yeah, you start.
Somewhat hospital pass going on there, it feels like. There are several points there, I think. I think partially it's about the power imbalance that you're saying, and about the individuals, the NGOs, but also the public authorities, and like ensuring everybody has appropriate information. They have access to information, that there's good science being done, that it's being shared as well. And that links into the environmental assessments, which is part of the system already, but also that being shared with people, and that relates into what I mentioned yesterday about Aarhus rights, and Karen Dubsky mentioned about a potential Aarhus Centre. So you have an individual right for access to information, and that underpins everything. And then there's rights to access to justice. Those rights can be strengthened. That is something that can also be considered. And sorry, the third one is public participation. As I said, this is something you're doing right now, but it is embedded more generally as well within the system. All three of those can be strengthened, and something like an Aarhus Centre could gather together information and share it. That's done in numerous countries around the world. It's part of the Aarhus Convention. It's something that they support. You mentioned judges knowing stuff about environmental law. That is a very dangerous thing for me to talk about, since I'm from a legal education background.
I can say it.
Environmental law is a relatively new area of specialty, so everybody's learning about environmental law gradually as it develops. An environmental court is something that has been mooted numerous times, and it is also an option. So some countries have developed it. I think it might possibly end up being discussed later on in the Assembly as well. But that could be something where you have a specialist court that deals with it. We actually, if you think about corporate law and the links with environment, we already kind of have a fast-tracked system for that before the courts, not for constitutional challenges, but for justice in relation to it, because it links into the commercial courts. So it goes through the commercial courts faster, but the legal system is so slow and so expensive. So they are things that you can definitely think about. I think that's probably enough for me for the moment. Micheál?
And just before Micheál comes in there, this is probably a good time, David, to mention the submissions that have come in. There's a couple of law groups who have submitted already, and actually one of their recommendations was an environmental court. So it might be worth having a read through those, because it might come up with ideas that are, you know, aligning with your own, and you can see then what the other members think of that. Sorry, Micheál.
There are two Micheáls here, so but okay, it's a very good question. You may recall yesterday in my presentation I mentioned Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, which was a really critical publication in the early 60s about the damage that chemicals that were being used principally for agriculture were causing to nature and a risk to human health. Now, she was attacked by the chemical industry, so that there were, from then and up to now, there are obviously huge lobbies in the climate debate, and obviously they are relevant to the biodiversity debate, that would not want business to be interfered with. But I don't think we should underestimate the power of civil society in this. I mean, a number of years ago in the EU, I was involved in coordinating an evaluation of the nature directives, which partly would have been triggered by a perception of certain interests that they were causing a nuisance, that these environmental laws were slowing down business, they were too cumbersome and so forth. And the environmental NGOs, once they got wind that this presented a risk to the integrity and the strength of this legislation, they launched the biggest campaign ever in terms of a public expression of concern that the EU ever had. 550,000 citizens voiced their concern in this. And that was a defining moment in a debate, showing that there was a huge constituency in relation to the fact that this matters. So the debate here also shows that it matters. But I would say there are a number of critical things that you need to bear in mind in any debate, because there will be different perspectives. Firstly, you have to have good evidence. You have to have good science to say what really is happening. So if, for example, agriculture, certain practices in agriculture are causing damage to nature, if there's evidence to show that, that has to be upfront in the debate, so that we don't actually end up in kind of futile conflicts without having the science and the evidence to inform that. Another critical factor that I would say you should really argue very, very strongly for is transparency of processes. The more you have in the public domain transparent processes, the better it is for everybody, including those who disagree with you. So when we deal with these laws and implementation and nature, it has to be as transparent as possible what is happening, how it's happening, why things aren't happening, so then there can be public accountability. So I would say you should argue for greater transparency, and the more transparent, the harder it is to actually have behind the scenes activities that are not in the spirit of what we're trying to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Micheál. Thanks, David, for that. Emma, your hand was up on table 11.
Hiya, Emma. Yesterday we spoke a little bit about trying to reverse some of the biodiversity loss that we are experiencing at the moment, and we also spoke about like the functioning of ecosystems at the same time. With that in mind, should community composition be the measure by which we see if biodiversity is recovering, or do you believe that a standard biodiversity metric is sufficient going forward?
Thank you, Emma.
I can say so. God.
Jenny, James?
Yeah. It's just, there's no one single metric that can measure something so complex. And we do a lot of work on biodiversity metrics, and even there's no one metric. So across the different taxonomic groups that we see, so what we're looking towards now is we can do things like rapid assessments of ecosystem quality and define an ecosystem quality in terms of its functioning. And in terms of its functioning, then that can be its functioning in terms of preserving the ecosystem services that we as humans need, but also its functioning in terms of providing the space for other species in which we're all dependent on as a community on the earth itself, you know. So there's a lot of work going on this, a lot of science is advancing on it. But I think the easiest way in terms of communication with the public would be is if we had, for each of the ecosystems we have, say grasslands, croplands, peatlands, woodlands, urban environment, we define as a society the type of quality that we want in terms of our needs as a species, but also the needs of other species. And when that's defined, then we have a vision for what we want to achieve. And then as scientists, we measure that using very translatable science that the public understand as well in terms of specific metrics. So we're working towards this. We're actually applying some of these into what we term these results-based payments for farmers and agri-environmental schemes. So we try and translate all this complexity into a simple field scoring system based on a number of metrics, and the higher the points the quality of the field is in, the more payments you can get towards it, try to link it into value systems. So there's a lot of work on this, but the one thing that we have learned is that there isn't one silver bullet of one single metric, and it will be multiple things, and a lot of it will come back to what we define as a society as good, essentially.
And I would add to that that because there's not a single metric and it's complex, it means you need people on the ground all the time. So the value of places like the National Biodiversity Data Centre and National Parks and Wildlife Service, the people are actually out there observing, gathering data. So much data, imagine it from all over the whole of Ireland over every season, every year, and you need that evidence and science, and that needs funding.
Thank you, Jenny and James and Emma. Hillary's at table 6, and I will come back to you, Hilary. I'm just going to try and make sure we've got another diversity of voices just up among the tables. So actually table 7 first, and then I'll come to you, David, on table 4.
Hi, my name is Tommy. Our table had a question, I suppose more back to basics, but just in terms of what measures or incentives are currently in place that are specifically, I suppose, driven to help biodiversity loss across all of the sectors. Obviously there's plans to do it, protecting upland, peatlands and all that, but can you give us an example of other incentives, I suppose, that are currently in place?
Yeah.
It's James.
Yeah. There, in terms of sectors, in terms of incentives to protect biodiversity, there isn't an awful lot in many sectors. We have some in the Common Agricultural Policy in terms of the agriculture sector, in terms of our agri-environmental schemes that are set to actually put incentives in place to protect the environment in general in terms of climate, water and biodiversity. So also there's opportunities within business for eco-labels, for example, and better understanding among the consumer of what is the impact of the particular product on the ecosystem, and maybe having a higher price for that product, and that value then being returned to the primary producer. But they're not very well developed at the moment, particularly in terms of biodiversity. So the main ways we have to manage this is we have the basic regulation, which is the laws that basically industry and sectors have to adhere to. So you can actually incentivize behavioural change through the basic regulation, like the control mechanisms that was talked about yesterday. Then we have the taxation system. Within the taxation system on climate, we have the carbon taxes, which is essentially supposed to be inform a carrot and a stick, that you have basically raised the revenue through the carbon tax to disincentivise activities that you don't want to happen. But that carbon tax then should be ring-fenced to go back into activities that should be promoting the carbon sequestration and value on that side. Now, some of the carbon tax in Ireland, for example, is going into the funding of the agri-environmental schemes for climate action on farms, and co-funding the money that's coming from Europe. So we're seeing some of that already. But then the other is basically using our public pot of general finances to go back in, as well as using some private money. So these are not very well developed at the moment. We have some mechanisms in terms of public policy. Most of the public money, 33% of it, or over a third of it, goes to agriculture from the European budget, and that's to pay for these associated public goods that agriculture potentially can provide, as well as actually paying for some of the regulations that farmers have to adhere to in terms of environmental law. But it's been developed since the early 90s, but it's not there yet by any stretch of the imagination, I would think, unless anyone else wants to comment.
It's a really important question. Incentivization, to a significant extent, it means where the investment funding opportunities are. And it's a constant debate at the European level when it comes to nature policy as to where we can support funding, and many different EU funds do provide opportunities for investment in nature. I hope that Andy Bleasday will say something about the Life Fund, which is a very, very strategically useful fund to have these catalytic projects that can actually lead to greater things, and there are some very good examples in Ireland. As James said, the big fund is the agricultural fund, and you have to see that not only in terms of the agri-environment possibilities to pay farmers for doing environment and now climate services, but also how the bigger fund, the single farm payment, how that is used in a way that actually is environmentally supportive. And there are provisions now under that bigger part of the agriculture budget. So for a huge part of the land, that is the key mechanism that supports. There is also some funding in the context of fisheries and maritime policy to help fishers to carry out ways in more sustainable, less damaging in terms of the type of equipment that they use and the methods that they use. There are research budgets that are actually trying to promote cooperation on biodiversity and other elements under the European research programs. So public funding is critical to the debate in relation to supporting biodiversity conservation. But James has said, also in the private sector, corporate social responsibility. Again, going back to this idea of transparency, that corporations who use nature, because many corporations, businesses depend upon nature to actually, for their practices. So the extractive industries, the whole food industry. So as part of corporate social responsibility, I think we need to be more incentivizing them to not only avoid damage to biodiversity, but to actually contribute to biodiversity objectives. And I think that's something that should be looked at more. But it is primarily public funding and seen as a public good.
I'll just add a small little bit in, hopefully, just to note, part of the reason for the agriculture is the substantial size of agricultural land on the island. So we're talking about, I think it's 70% or something like that for the agricultural land on the island, of land on the island is used for agriculture. So that's a large reason why there's so much funding and focus on that, because they are basically the main opportunity also to help promote biodiversity. I don't know the specifics of the funds and when they were exactly available, but we've had more generally funds previously to plant trees, not necessarily always native trees is an issue that would arise and whether it's suitable or not, but we've had incentives for that. In planning conditions, it can be seen as a sort of command control, or it can be seen as an incentive, but there would be links into local developments and doing sustainable elements and biodiversity, so you can have aspects put in that are quasi-incentives there. And then the research projects, the money for undertaking pure research, but also management, for going and doing management at the same time as research. There are a lot of projects that are undertaken on biodiversity sites, on protected sites around the island where these are done. But what you're getting the sense of from the three of us speaking here is that it, other than under the agricultural sort of focus point, it is quite piecemeal. It's quite sort of scattered, and it can be difficult to identify the relevant funds and what they can be used for. So there is funding there. It's just hard to get to grips with sometimes.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for that. David on table 4, and then I'll go to Hilary on table 6, and then I'll ask more hands after that.
How are you doing? Question from our table that we keep coming back to is, in your opinion and in your experiences, is there enough legislation in place already? And the problem or the issue that we're having is that there's no cohesion, there's no policy, there's no direction, there's no enforcement. Is that where, in your opinion, the issue is coming from? Or should we be looking at additional legislation as well? Thank you.
How blunt an answer am I allowed to give? Okay, so firstly, I'll qualify your question a little bit and go, it's not that there isn't any implementation or any enforcement, it's just that there are flaws throughout it. But there are flaws with the existing system, but as an environmental governance legal sort of person, I would also like to see potentially changes to the actual law, changes to the actual policy. And that could be something like, I was mentioning, an overarching general law, which gives a bit of, it helps with the coherence. So you have overarching objectives and principles that are a bit more ambitious than within the EU level at this stage, just a bit updated and drive it. Or it could be thinking about environmental rights or rights of nature or access to nature as well, but that needs to be very well considered to make sure we don't do more harm. There isn't a perfect solution with legislation, though. You need to have good legislation. It needs to be, as I was saying, it needs to be ambitious, well designed, well supported, and coherent, all of those things. But the well supported includes the implementation, the enforcement, the political will behind it. And then there's everything that goes alongside the law as well. It's essentially up to you guys to think about what you would like to do. My opinion is I'd like a little bit more law. I'd like the law done better. And then I'd like a lot of other stuff alongside the law, because the law should generally be last resort.
Okay, thanks for that. Mary James, yeah?
Yeah, just in relation to this, our interactions with the environment are quite complex. Our understanding of it is only at the tip of the iceberg. And it's one of the things that we as scientists need to be very open-minded about this. As we gain new knowledge, our opinions should change and do change. And then as you gain more and you understand more, but by definition, the law has to change to keep pace with that. So it's not that we will never, it's not that we don't have, we need more legislation, it's that we need better legislation, and it needs to keep pace with the knowledge base and the advancements in science, advancements in society, and our collective knowledge as a society as a whole. So there will always be a need to check and recheck and improve our policies as our understanding improves. And so, but it's more, not about more, but it's about better. And in particular with this, we see that the ways our laws are designed at the moment, it's very much, there's this sector here, there's this piece of legislation here, there's water here, there's biodiversity here, there's agriculture here, there's industry, there's corporations, it's all separate pieces. I think you know more about this, but I think in law it's more complex, but we need to move toward more coordinating legislation, particularly on the environment, particularly like the examples of the Water Framework Directive in relation to water, trying to bring all the different piecemeal bits of legislation together. We move towards a framework directive. We need to be, as our knowledge understands, we need to be moving towards them frameworks, the more coordination of the policies overall. So it's not more, it's better, and it always needs to change to keep pace with our understanding. Given, I think that's one thing we need to understand here as a whole. We haven't got much answers at all, really, because as scientists, this is so complex, and we're only at the tip of the iceberg in terms of our understanding. And it'd be very, very bad of us to give the impression that we know what we're talking about in the context of this. We know a certain amount of what we're talking about. I hate the word expert. We're just specialists in particular small fields of this, you know. So you need to be taking your own knowledge, your own understanding, your knowledge for your interactions with society as a whole. Maybe we can point some individuals, but particularly we've asked for an opinion here. And this way I always give an opinion. None of our opinions are any more valid than any of yours, you know.
Thanks, James. I know Micheál and Micheál want to both come in, so I'll let you both come in first.
Just to say, David, I think it's a great question, and it's one that people in the environmental world talk about a lot as well. And maybe Andy Bleasdale might talk about this, and Shirley, who are up, you know, it's a good time to be talking about it this morning straight away from their perspective. But I would say, having worked in various government departments over 40 years and state agencies, that the area of environmental law is weak, and to use the phrase that Mary said, uncoordinated, and also we need better legislation. And one specific observation is the people in Parks and Wildlife, where Andy works, there just isn't enough resource in terms of legal expertise. You're talking again, I used the phrase last night about something in a kind of offhand way about two men and a dog, you know. But the same applies, frankly. There isn't enough resources in the area of national parks and wildlife to improve and to reform. We have a Wildlife Act that goes back 40 years. It's very difficult for the staff who are enforcement people in national parks and wildlife to take successful enforcements. This is their own experience, and they've said this many times, and this was published in the Review of National Parks and Wildlife. And one of the reasons why is because of the way that the laws are written. They do need to be updated and reviewed, the habitats and birds directives, how they were transposed and brought up to date with what we now know, as James said. And the second thing then is Laura Burke was here yesterday from the EPA, and the EPA do this thing called the Status of the Irish Environment every 4 years. And generally it's a kind of a review of the science, but also a policy statement. And they've come out and said very clearly, for the first time, and the EPA has been there for more than 30 years, we need an overall environmental policy, including a review of legislation. Because for the very reason that was said by Mary, we have bits and pieces of legislation here and there, but there isn't actually a statement of principles. What are the principles in terms of biodiversity loss and so on, anywhere clear enough that you can then hang your hat on? And the last thing I would say, which definitely will come up again in the conversations, and Mary Dobbs touched on it, this idea of environmental court. There was a question about it earlier on. We don't have sufficient expertise either. One part of it is within parts of my life in terms of legal, expertise to draft legislation or time to do it. The judges, God bless them, have to deal with everything from road offences and spitting all the way to, ecosystems. And so in other countries in Europe and in states in America like Vermont, they have decided that environmental law is a specialised area and should have an environmental court. And so I think that's a topic that we will come back to, and there certainly are submissions on it. So if you were to work on the three things, strengthen the capacity of the main agency Parks and Wildlife, bring in some overarching legislation with principles, as Mary has said, to bring it together, and thirdly, more expertise in the judiciary, we'd make some progress.
Without good environmental laws, we're lost. The environment really doesn't have a voice except articulated through what laws and standards that we actually subscribe to. I've been involved in this game for 40 years, and I think that the situation for biodiversity would be so much worse. It's not good, but it would be so much worse without things like the Habitats Directive and the other environmental laws that we have. Is it complete, that body of laws that we have? I would argue that we need a restoration law, and that's why the European Commission has put forward this, that we have a purposeful, planned agenda for restoration over the coming decades. So I would see that as a significant gap that needs to be addressed in the context of biodiversity laws. But other than that, I would advise some caution in terms of opening up a Pandora's box about all environmental laws, because that will occupy, and I'm sure people like Mary would be very happy because it will keep them going for the next 10 to 20 years in terms of endless debates. And I really think that we have very good laws, we just need to implement them better and to identify what are the blocks in terms of good delivery of legislation. And we talked about that in terms of resources, capacity, outreach, and also the political support. So I would say, yes, the governance system is critical in this debate. It won't work unless there's a good joined up governance. And of course, the different pieces of legislation, sometimes different departments are in government are dealing with different environmental directives. So you need to, that's part of governance to make sure. And of course, people, the citizens, need to be better informed as to what the laws are and the rights. So my personal view is that there are very good biodiversity laws out there. There are a few gaps, we talked about soil as well, but that's not the major area of the problem. It's really better implementation of what we've got and supporting mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Micheál. And before the room gets petrified that we all have to become legal experts in order to tell them what to do with this is something that the Assembly and the Eighth Amendment also were grappling with, but actually it's the job of the Assembly to make a recommendation to government to do the framework perhaps, or to improve the legislation, and you can be specific about it, but you don't have to tell them exactly what it is. It's not the job of the Assembly to come up with the legal definitions of it. So just to keep that in mind, if it's something that the Assembly wants to do and agrees on, you give a suggestion, a recommendation of what the overarching thing is, and then it's up to the Oireachtas, the government, to go and actually do it. So it's not up to the room to come up with the wording on that. So we're going to go to Hilary on table number 6, please.
Hi, thanks. My first, well, there's just two high-level questions, and I guess David's point touched on one of them, which is this implementation issue. I see a huge amount of really passionate people here that, I found yesterday quite emotional, and I could feel emotion from the panel and a level of frustration, and I found that really sad, that, everybody has great intentions. And I do feel the money is there. I'd be aware that there's a lot of funding available for stuff. But this implementation issue, and we're all sitting here talking about biodiversity. But I'm just afraid that you know, when it comes to the recommendations, and I know, Aoibhinn, you've very clearly explained how the outcome of this will go through, but at the end of the day, is it the political will that's going to make it happen or not? And is that what happens? I mean, are we down to politics here? And if we are, will we see the politicians here? You know, will we see the councillors? Will we see the TDs? Will we see the minister? And understand their real appetite for dealing with this? Because, and it's not just for biodiversity, we see it, it's an Irish thing maybe, I don't know. But like the implementation is it really, you know? Like Micheál, you just mentioned that there is loads of laws there, but you know, why aren't they happening? Like the EPA yesterday said we have the targets, that we're not delivering on them. But why is it? You know, and I'm not expecting you to answer that because I know it's a very high level question, but I really want us all to think, you know, the why of that, you know, and is there anything we can do for it? And one of that on cohesion is I noticed on the what you call the biodiversity plan, the one that's being, yeah. So on the website there, now I couldn't see it, maybe I missed it, but there's a public consultation ongoing there for that. So people are putting submissions in there to that, but there's no mention of the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity on that website. So there's no joint dots there. They're asking people to submit to that. And the other high-level question, I'll be very brief even, is just, it struck me yesterday in terms of the reasons for the problems and everything else, and it came from Roman's original presentation about the population growth. And we say, and then the EPA are saying the main reasons for climate change are agriculture and building and da-da-da. But if we really think about it, isn't population the biggest single root cause here? And I'm not suggesting we do population control, but we really do need to make sure the population understand their individual responsibility in this whole scheme of things. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hilary. There's a lot in there. We'll try and pick that apart. The one thing I just want to tell you there, and it is confusing and maybe a little bit frustrating that the National Biodiversity Action Plan is looking for submissions now, and we're also looking for submissions. Their plan was in train already when the Citizens' Assembly was announced. It's happening in tandem, but the main thing about our Citizens' Assembly is that we are independent. We are not associated with any government body. We are not associated with any government department. Nobody can suggest, would you edge the conversation this way or that way? So we have to be independent. So there is no mention of the Citizens' Assembly as part of the National Biodiversity Action Plan because we are separate from them. But yes, maybe unfortunate we're both looking for submissions at the same time, but the fact that our recommendations will be published first and we hope will then be included in the National Biodiversity Action Plan, hopefully there'll be a crossover in that. Now I'll throw to Art and the EAG to go to some of the other questions, but one thing that I wanted to say to you in terms of political will, we are the voters, and if we say to politicians when they're coming looking at our votes, what are you going to do for the environment? That's when it will become an issue. Until then, they can all ignore it because they don't think anyone else cares. That's from a personal perspective on that. So I do think that's part of our individual responsibility to make sure that if we think it's important, it should be part of the national conversations all the time. Now I'll throw to Art.
Yes, I mean, it's a perennial question, but maybe just on the plan, Andy Bleasdale, who's up later on, he'll be giving us an update on the state of the plan in about 10 minutes' time. So be careful what you wish for. You might just get it, you know. So they always say that when the gods wish to punish us, they answer our prayers, you know. On the issue about whether this is a government priority or not, it's an interesting question. Nobody knows from day to day what is going to be the government priority. I think you can take it that the fact that the government has spent scarce money in gathering 100 people in a room to ask them this question, that they're not just doing this for a laugh. You know, this is a serious business. We have a really, really strong track record in this country on running citizens' assemblies and the government taking action on the basis of the recommendations and the outputs as well. So you can never say anything with any great certainty, but if I was a betting man, then I would say that yes, whatever comes from this group has a better chance than most of reaching government implementation.
Sorry, Micheál 1, Micheál 2.
To respond, if I can respond briefly to Hilary, is it? and you were saying about, you know, feeling a sense of frustration or whatever. There was one slide that Micheál O'Brien presented yesterday, and I think it's worth looking at it again and circulating it and so on, which is what are the drivers, or also what are the blockers to successful implementation. And some of them, I think that just to think about them again, the first one was political support. And my judgment would be that for about 30 years, there has been a lack of political support. Michael D. Higgins, when he was a minister, and some people here worked with him in the mid-1990s, when there was a fair amount of effort in creating of the Heritage Council and Dúchas and some of the structures that are there still in the landscape, there was a strong awareness. He had been to Rio. He was the minister that brought the Convention on Biodiversity to the Dáil, etc., etc. I was working as part of that government as well at the time. So I saw him in action. And genuinely you could see that culture, biodiversity, heritage were high on the agenda. They were not as high on the agenda in the decades that followed for various reasons, and Michael D's vision to some extent was lost. But I think that there is a change in terms of greater environmental awareness for all sorts of reasons now in the public, mainly driven by climate change, in fairness, right? But we have to try and make sure in our conversations that we link climate, biodiversity, water, nature are all inseparable. You can't work on one without the other. And I think that's an opportunity. And politically, there's no doubt about it that the energy behind climate will continue. So the job of this assembly, to my mind, is to make sure that there's 2 or 3 horses together, not just one horse driving that, and that you hitch biodiversity with that together. So politically it's possible. And the other things then that Micheál mentioned in terms of improved resources for parks and wildlife, for sure that's happening, but it needs to continue to happen. And improved governance. We had a question yesterday about our government departments working together. We have a long way to go on that. We need to strengthen those links. So in other words, that one department, going back to the thing about should we have a separate department, I agree with Art's answer, unlikely, but what we definitely have to have is stronger links across government, so that the lead department in biodiversity, which at the moment is, we call it the Customs House, housing, planning and so on, can't do it on its own. It clearly needs agriculture. They have the biggest budget. It needs a lot of other government departments working with it. So governance, and then on top of that, for sure, information, data, research has been mentioned over and over again. Those elements, to my mind, if they're in place, drive implementation. And I'd be hopeful that if we put a programme together, that they will strengthen implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Micheál. And Micheál, can you respond to that as well, please?
Thank you, Micheál, for referring to the slide I put up yesterday. And I think there's some valid points, because that was based on evidence, looking at what works. And it's good. You know, just to say, in the course of my career, I met quite a few politicians, and I never met one that said they were against biodiversity. And no, it's worth bearing that in mind. I don't think that there is a party out there that says we are the anti-biodiversity movement. But they will always say there's more pressing priorities. And that's really what it boils down to, is this is seen to be nice to have, a luxury in good times, and not an essential for underpinning our lives and quality of lives. And, you know, you should bear that in mind, because we're probably heading to a little bit more difficult period this coming winter in the context of the economics, the pressures that people will be under, and this might be seen to be a little bit more esoteric. So part of the challenge is to be able to communicate the significance of the topic and its relevance to people's lives. That would be my first message to reflect on, because I think we really, unless we see this as important, and people would say it's as important as climate change. I was saying to Even maybe yesterday that if climate change is all about a suntan and better weather, I'm all for it, you know, but it's not. It's about its massive disruption of ecosystems and the functioning of Earth and the life support systems that we have. And that's biodiversity. So the two are interconnected. It's the same debate about sustainability. I would say that part of the way forward is, and you know, we have the legislation, it's about how you incentivize people to do the right thing, how we work with farmers, rather than saying all farmers are bad. No, we say, how do we work with farmers to incentivize them to care for nature as part of their stewardship of the land? That's just one example. And I think you need to emphasize the benefits that get, because there's been a whole debate about, you know, we haven't heard anything about natural capital, which is this whole thing about the benefits that nature provides, nature's services, in terms of clean water, in terms of the carbon that's stored, in terms of actually its economic benefits for tourism. You know, big ideas like the Wild Atlantic Way, why isn't that linked in with all these wonderful nature areas that provide a resource for nature and people? So you need to think about it in terms of its value to a sustainable economy. In my view, that's the incentive. And fundamental, I think, is to generate a sense of pride in what we've got. You know, we talk about cultural heritage, but you also need to talk about natural heritage. I mean, I think I said it to a few people. You know, we have the Book of Kells in Trinity. If somebody went into Trinity College tomorrow and started tearing out the pages of the Book of Kells, or went up to Newgrange and bulldozed it or put a bomb underneath it, we would see this as a desecration of our heritage. And yet, raised bogs, which carry 7,000 years of the history of our country, are being destroyed, that are protected. So we have to have this awareness and appreciation of what we've got and its significance, not only for future generations, but for this generation. And I think that has to be part of the debate in terms of education, in terms of awareness and a sense of pride. Because Ireland has great beauty in its natural heritage, and that should be first and foremost in terms of saying we have this wonderful nature and we need to care for it.
Thank you, Micheál. Thank you, Micheál. I think that leaves us in a great place actually to start the next discussion. In one way, I'm apologising because we only got through 7 questions there, but I think they were 7 great questions that spanned an awful lot of the conversations that came out of yesterday, and it was great to have the time to answer them properly. So thank you for the questions to the tables, and please give another thank you to the EAG and to Micheál for answering them so well, and we're just going to take a break before we start into the next session. Oh, yeah. Any questions unanswered, we will respond to you through the members area on the EAG. Okay, thank you.